Messianas. That's the way it works in Poland. It worked in Poland for 1,000 years. Well, guess what? Tunis is the Chelm of North Africa. Egyptians, at least we're better than the Tunisians. The Tunisians having 12 days of democratic, this is unacceptable. Into the streets. And into the streets they go. Okay, now I'll give you my fourth model. Here's my model. And I first said it 2 weeks ago. I thought it was my Chiddush. I've since read it in several places. People smarter than me are saying it also. I think, to me, this seems pretty clear. I'm going to give you 4 countries. Egypt is now the 5th that fit this model so far. South Korea, the Philippines, Chile, Indonesia. What do they have in common? All 3 of them were essential American allies. South Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, about as essential as they come. All had aging dictators who had carried America's water for decades, who were loyal to American interests. All had militaries that were trained, taught, fueled, fed by the United States. And in all 4 countries, we worked quietly, covertly and overtly, to gently nudge out the dictator. He left with his dignity intact, his bank account intact, his family safe. Nudged all 4 of them out. What did we do next? The army ruled, and in various cases it was transitioned to democracy. Now, this only can work where we have an American-trained military. It doesn't work in Libya. We're finding it out the hard way, aren't we? Right? Horrible, horrible news from Libya. It doesn't work in Libya. And now that we've gotten the American diplomats out and the American citizens out, our countries can and should speak out, and they are speaking out. And we'll see how Libya plays out. Everyone's saying it was Reagan. It wasn't Reagan. It was Richard Nixon who first called Gaddafi the mad dog of the Middle East, and he has really kept that distinction for a long time. But it works in a country like Egypt, uniquely in a country like Egypt. The Egyptian military high command were all in Washington, D.C. when the riots broke out. Isn't that interesting? They flew back. Did we plant the Facebook page? It was anonymous. No one knew who did it. And then 2 days after the revolution, the revolt started, the Egyptian secret police arrested the head of the riot, wrote that Facebook page. And they beat him up a little bit, 12 days in prison. At least he was supposed to be in prison those 12 days. He comes out, he gets half an hour of television time on the main Egyptian TV network. I want to arrange that. He's 26 years old. He's the head of Google Egypt. Who do you think he works for? All of a sudden, he's the face of the revolution. Not some Muslim Brotherhood guy, but the fellow from Google Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood had a candidate, a Nobel Prize-winning Iranian stooge, as Malcolm Hoenlein called him. So what happens? A Nobel Prize-winning Egyptian-born chemist flies back from America and says, "Here I am!" And the generals put him on the ruling council of the country. He's suddenly this chemist. Suddenly they have 2 Nobel Prize winners now on the council. They got theirs and they got ours. It gets better. The military does not shoot at the people in the streets. The military is validated that way. The military showed their side of the revolution that way. And here comes to me the single biggest proof that this revolution, that this was stage managed, at least in my mind. Mubarak apparently wanted to resign 2 weeks ago Thursday night. It was announced he was going to resign. My wife called me 4 times during the day, giving me updates. He's going to resign, he's going to resign. Because she knew I was working on this, preparing a speech. And what happened? He gave a long rambling speech and did not resign. He flew out of the country Friday morning. Friday at 6:50 Friday night Cairo time, the new vice president, the former head of the feared secret police, the man who would have been reviled had he made this announcement 6 months before, now he's a hero, Suleiman, not the guy who built the walls around Jerusalem, his namesake, announces Mubarak is out of the country. He was in Sharm el-Sheikh, has left Egypt proper, and you're free. Why'd they wait until Friday at 6:50? So I'll give you my theory. And I ran this by at least one person who says to me he thinks it makes a lot of sense, who knows much more than me, with a name I cannot use. You see, between 15 and 20 million Egyptians go to mosque every Friday morning. Every Friday morning, 1/4 of that country is in mosque. Had Mubarak resigned Thursday night, there would not be no time. There wouldn't be time to rehearse the speeches with every head of every mosque. The heads of every mosque in Egypt work for the government on a government salary. Their remarks are carefully censored and monitored. Had Mubarak resigned Thursday night, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is there, shadowy, estimated 20% support, people claim, would have had a chance to get some of these people into the mosques to make speeches. Mubarak resigned. Mubarak's renounced resignation is announced at 6:50. Soif Zman Rabbeinu Tam for Shabbos in Egypt was 6:45. The Matthew Garland of the main mosque had closed the mosque doors at 6:45. Those all 72 minutes were done. Then they announced he's gone. They had a whole week to prepare the mosque for what to say. And last Friday, Kumbaya. 1 million people came out of the mosques in Cairo. 250,000 in Alexandria. They weren't rioting. They went to the Grand Square, Tahrir and Square, the Grand Square in Alexandria, and they sang the praises of the new revolution. Exactly the way they were told to do it in mosques that morning. To me, that's the proof. That's the frosting on the cake that what we saw here. Not easily duplicatable. Unlikely to be duplicated. Did we plan it? I don't know. Did we co-opt it? More likely. Was that Facebook page just in case? Probably. I'll tell you a story. I was with, I think I may have mentioned this last night. Idi Amin, the vicious, ugly, racist, murderous dictator of Uganda, was pushed out by the Tanzanians in 1983, 84, and it was widely reported in the media that the Mossad was involved. And we were in Israel, Senator Moynihan and I, a few weeks later. The senator said to his friend Yitzhak Shamir, says, that you guys did a good job, Senator. We would never interfere in the internal affairs of a friendly foreign country. It was a good job, wasn't it? You know, about a couple of weeks ago, President Obama gave 4 medals to people who had done important work for the CIA in the 1980s. Their names were not released. Their pictures were not released. The whole ceremony was off the record in Langley. Only their families know who they are. I assume 30 years from now, the President of the United States will be giving medals to some CIA people for what they did this past few weeks. Once in a while, we get things right. Which I think we should be very proud. As an American, I am extremely proud of my country. I think we did this one right. Is it Iran? No. When the head of Google Egypt got up in Tahrir Square at 7 o'clock Friday night, 10 minutes after the announcement, the first words out of his lips were, "Thank you, Mark Zuckerberg." That's a promo. Highly unlikely that the Ayatollah Khomeini would have announced that. There were almost no anti-American slogans and very few anti-Israel slogans. In fact, ironically, when Mubarak's goons came into the square to beat up the protesters, they shouted, "Kill the Jews." And some of the protesters of the Muslim Brotherhood ilk, and they were there, had anti-Israeli slogans. They were a very small percentage, and they were generally shouted out and shouted down. That's important. This was not an anti-American revolution. And the United States, I think, played it well. I think we showed enough support for Mubarak so that other leaders around the world would not think we're going to cut and run on them right away. But once he lost the mandate of heaven, once his own generals turned against him, probably at our behest, we gave him a couple of weeks, and then we packed him out, safe, his family, and his bank accounts. They're very, they did not leave poor. Yeah. And again, had the generals taken over on their own, there would have been a civil war in the country. Instead, they are cheered as the agents of change. For those who have been following more recent news from Egypt, hasn't get much publicity. I've been having a hard time tracking it down myself. But apparently, the secret police are, to some measure, being dismantled and replaced by the military. No complaints. No complaints. A story and a Dvar Torah, and I'm done. The story. Indira Gandhi was assassinated in 1984 by one of her bodyguards. Senator Moynihan had been ambassador to India. He knew Indira Gandhi well. He gets a phone call from President Ronald Reagan at 5:30 at home the day of the assassination. He says, "Pat, I'd like you to be in Andrews Air Force Base in 90 minutes. The senator lived about, 75 minutes from Andrews Air Force Base. You're flying with Robert Dole, the majority leader of the Senate, and George Shultz, Secretary of State, to represent me at the funeral of Indira Gandhi." You don't say no to the President of the United States. You rush to the airport. If you have to fly to India, it's not the worst way to go. Air Force 2. Air Force 2 is Air Force 1 without the President. It's the same plane. Private cabins, showers. You could do worse. Flat-out beds. 18-hour flight with a refueling stop in Morocco, I think. 18-hour flight to get to India. They're on the grounds 5.5 hours. The widower sets fire to the funeral pyre, does not have to jump on, only works the other way, and they burn her remains. There's a little cotillion afterwards, a little bit of a wake, a shiva, and they fly back. It is 4:20 in the morning, Cairo time. There was scheduled refueling stop in Cairo when they're awakened by the pilot. Gentlemen, I'm really sorry to wake you up, but we can't get our diesel fuel, we can't get our jet fuel until you meet with Hansi Mubarak. He insists on meeting you, no fuel unless you meet with him. That sounds pretty serious. Now, George Shultz is in his Secretary of State pajamas. They have the great seal of the U.S. government on the pocket. He's not happy. Robert Dole is one of my favorite. I mean, I voted for Robert Dole for Bill Clinton for the second term. I'm a big fan of Robert Dole's. Robert Dole, as you may know, is crippled in his right arm from World War II. It takes him an hour to get dressed in the morning. Pat Moynihan had to dress him because the limousine was waiting for them right in front of the airplane. Half an hour later, they're zooming through the streets of Cairo. Sirens blaring. This is a dictator, he doesn't care. They get to the presidential castle at 5:15 in the morning. They're greeted by a 19-gun salute. The works. They walk into a vast hall. Senator says, oh, it's like the size of the Pentagon. A vast hall. And the tables are groaning under roast lamb and every imaginable delicacy. There's the entire military high command of Egypt. Their medals glistening on their chests. They've been sitting there since 3:30 in the morning rehearsing their role. There's the entire cabinet of Egypt. The entire leadership of the country has turned out to meet 3 Americans. Footnote. About 6 months before, we had introduced legislation to try to move the United States Embassy in Israel from Jerusalem, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. As I mentioned last night, I did 5 such pieces of legislation. I was so successful that the embassy is still in Tel Aviv. The only progress we made is that Obama at least didn't lie to us. He said he wouldn't move it, and he didn't move it. The other guys lied. Reagan didn't lie either. Reagan said he was against it. Reagan said he would veto our legislation. Reagan said American embassies would burn throughout the Middle East if it passed. And Menachem Begin, a recluse, calls Pat Moynihan. He says, Pat, never fight the battles of Jerusalem in the halls of Congress. Then he explained, most Americans believe Jerusalem's the capital of Israel. From Sunday school, from the hymns they sang, from Bible stories. He said, if you have a fight with Ronald Reagan over this, you may win the vote, but you'll lose the war. Millions of Americans will say, oh, I didn't know. President Reagan told me. Tel Aviv's the capital of Israel. Don't do it. So we called Yitzhak Shamir and said, we're not doing it. Half an hour later, Foreign Minister Shimon Peres calls back and says, don't give them something for nothing. We could use an extra $1 billion. Tell Reagan you'll pull your bill for an extra $1 billion in aid to Israel. So we were considering it. The next day, it's not related. The next day, Indira Gandhi's killed. It's not related, I don't think. There we are in Cairo. I wasn't there. There's the senator in Cairo. Mubarak says, I hear Israel's asked you for an extra $1 billion. Hans, you made peace with. Of course I made peace. Here's a letter from Jimmy Carter at Camp David. For every $3 in money Israel gets, Egypt gets 2. Here's a letter from Ronald Reagan, just a year and a half ago when I was in Washington. For every $3 Israel gets, Egypt gets 2. Gentlemen, we could use an extra 2/3 of $1 billion really bad. Generals, what will happen if we don't get that money? And like a Gregorian chant from a Greek choir, Moynihan, you had to believe these guys have been practicing all night. They say, the Muslim Brotherhood will take over. He says, cabinet, what will happen? Chaos. He says, I'm subsidizing food, 80%. I can't afford it anymore. If I don't have this extra money, I'm gone. The only thing between me and the Muslim Brotherhood is your money. You will not leave Egypt. Do you promise you're giving Israel an extra $1 billion? Moynihan told Yitzhak Shamir later, get rid of AIPAC. You don't need lobbyists. All you need is Hansi Mubarak with an oil can. Those generals are running Egypt today. Their entire lifestyle depends on that American money. And that American money depends on one thing and one thing only, peace with Israel. Doesn't mean everything's going to be great. Doesn't mean, on the contrary, there are nuanceical changes that could wreak havoc. The best of intentions. I named 3. One I already mentioned. Who takes over the mosques of Egypt? They continue under government control. They continue to represent a moderate brand of Islam, which is a counterweight to the radical forms currently being preached in Mecca and Tehran. Crucial for Israel, crucial for us in America, by the way.